Court picks Alabama congressional map likely to mean Democratic gain. A panel of 3 federal judges on Thursday chose a new Alabama congressional map that maintains a black majority district in the state and establishes another near-black majority district that could flip a House seat for Democrats in 2024. Thursday's decision is the latest in a long legal battle that pitted Alabama's GOP-led legislature against Democrats and civil rights groups that argued that Republicans were illegally diluting the power of black voters in the state. About 27% of the state's voting population is black. In the map chosen Thursday, the state's 2nd congressional district has a black voting age population of 48.7%, and its 7th district maintains its black majority with a black voting age population of 51.9%. Top Republican elected officials in the state indicated that they will use the map during the 2024 election cycle, but that future legal challenges are expected. Alabama Secretary of State Wes Allen, Republican, said in a statement that his office will facilitate the 2024 election cycle in accordance with the map the federal court has forced upon Alabama and ordered us to use. But he also said that the legal portion of this process has not yet been completed. A full hearing on the redistricting issue will take place in the future, and I trust Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall to represent Alabama through that process, he said. In a statement, Marshall said that the state will abide by the court's order for the 2024 elections and expects to continue to defend the state's law in court for future elections. The case has been closely watched because of an array of challenges to congressional maps advancing in courts throughout the country that could give one political party or the other an advantage heading into the 2024 elections. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in June that Alabama's congressional map did not comply with the Voting Rights Act, because it unlawfully diluted the political power of black residents. The decision upheld the federal panel's earlier ruling. Alabama's legislature was subsequently tasked with redrawing its congressional map boundaries. After the legislature redrew the map in July and it was signed into law by Governor Kay Ivey, Republican, the same federal panel of judges found again that it did not comply with the Voting Rights Act. Instead of tasking the conservative state legislature with redrawing the maps again, the federal panel directed a special master and cartographer to create 3 proposed remedial maps to be filed by September 25. We do not take lightly federal intrusion into a process ordinarily reserved for the state legislature. But we have now said twice that this Voting Rights Act case is not close, the judges wrote in the order then. And we are deeply troubled that the state enacted a map that the state readily admits does not provide the remedy we said federal law requires. Late last month, the state of Alabama again tried to escalate the matter to the conservative-leaning U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court for a second time refused Alabama's attempt to hold the 2024 elections under a new congressional map judged to be an unlawful attempt to diminish the power of the state's black voters. The map put forward Thursday retains 86.9% of Alabamians in their district under the plan signed into law by Ivey this summer, the panel's order states. Democratic Party groups and voting rights advocacy groups involved in the case celebrated Thursday's decision. Ju.dy By.ington, executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Alabama, which was involved in the legal battle over the congressional map, said in a statement that the court's order means, for the first time, black voters in 2 congressional districts will have an opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice. Former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder, who served in the Obama administration, said that other states in the midst of similar litigation should take note. Other states with pending cases should view this map and this process as both an example of basic fairness and a warning that denying equal representation to black voters, violating the Voting Rights Act, and defying federal court orders is a direct tie to an odious past and will no longer be tolerated, Holder said in a statement issued by the National Redistricting Foundation, which backed litigation in the matter. Representative Susan DelBene, Democrat, Washington, chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, called the court's map selection a victory for democracy and the state's black communities. Today's decision affirms that Alabama will no longer have a map that dilutes the voting strength of black citizens, but rather one that reflects the diversity of the state and ensures every community's voice is heard in Congress, she added. Robert Barnes contributed to this report. Kevin McCarthy's election machine in limbo as GOP seeks new speaker. The deposed speaker spent 15 years building the political operation that won back control of the House in 2022. California Representative Kevin McCarthy spent 15 years building the political machine that won back control of the House in 2022, a sprawling operation with billionaire donor relationships he managed, a recruitment program he oversaw, and a network of shadowy political committees that intervened in primaries at the nod of his team. After only 269 days as House Speaker, the fate of that operation is now in question, raising concerns among Republican strategists and members of Congress about their ability to hold or grow their majority next year. McCarthy tried to calm those worries Friday at the Capitol, telling reporters that he plans to run for re-election and stay involved in elections. He did not state any preference on his successor, calling the two leading contenders for the job, Majority Leader Steve Scalise, Republican, Louisiana, and House Judiciary Chairman Jim Jordan, Republican, Ohio, good friends. We'll keep the majority. I'm going to help the people I got here, and we are going to expand it further, McCarthy said. Effective control of the biggest electoral institutions that fund Republican House campaigns, like the Congressional Leadership Fund and the National Republican Congressional Committee, is certain to pass to his successor. But the relationships that drive their bank accounts are not certain to follow, nor are the less well-known operations that support both groups in the shadows of campaign finance regulations. CLF, the centerpiece of House Republican efforts, has grown increasingly dependent on just a few donors in recent years, mostly billionaires who are driven to give more for ideological reasons. The group raised at least $88.5 million last cycle from just 8 families and millions more from McCarthy's own California donors. After McCarthy was toppled, the NRCC announced it was postponing a fall gala event next week in Dallas. The happiest people in Washington this week are the people at the DCCC and House Majority PAC who just saw the #1 fundraiser in the Republican field taken off the field, said Mike Shields, a McCarthy ally and campaign strategist who previously ran CLF and worked as political director of the NRCC, referring to 2 pro-democratic committees. McCarthy's aspiring replacements have boasted about their different fundraising strengths as they have sought votes from their colleagues. Allies of Jordan, a firebrand known for rapid-fire cable news appearances, have even been circulating private emails that Scalise's staff have sent to Jordan's team in recent months, asking Jordan to sign off on emails and text messages in his name that would jointly raise money for the two men. No one is better positioned to help boost the confidence in fundraising than Jim Jordan, said Russell Dye, a spokesman for Jordan. He's the only person who can communicate with both the grassroots and the mega donors. Scalise has pushed back with a memo from his team calling him a fundraising powerhouse with $170 million in lifetime fundraising, including 413 days of travel time. While Kevin's fundraising was unmatched, Steve Scalise was easily the second most prolific fundraiser for the conference, said Representative Tony Gonzalez, Republican, Texas, who was backing Scalise for Speaker. But no one has argued that the transition will be painless. Donors and some Republican operatives have expressed concerns over whether the next speaker will remain as aggressive as McCarthy is in promoting candidates who can win swing seats or as ruthless as he has been in intervening to try to stop less electable or more disruptive candidates in Republican districts from making it to the House floor. Groups connected to McCarthy spent millions to defend incumbents against far-right challengers in primaries, sometimes using spending vehicles that were designed to conceal the identity of donors. They also weeded out Republican candidates that they thought did not belong in Washington, even if they could have won office. McCarthy allies were involved in 2022 in raising money for a group called Results for NC that helped to defeat one of McCarthy's own members, Representative Madison Cawthorn, Republican, North Carolina, after the freshman lawmaker infuriated his colleagues by talking on a podcast about seeing cocaine use in Washington and being invited to sex parties. Other groups, with names like American Liberty Action and the 1854 Fund, were deployed to take out the primary campaigns of Anthony Sabatini, a Florida friend of Representative Matt Gaetz, and former New York State Party Chair Carl Palladino, who suggested in a 2021 social media post that Nazi dictator Adolf Hitler is the kind of leader we need today. CLF, under the guidance of McCarthy's team, intervened in a Florida primary to help defeat Laura Loomer, a political activist who has described herself as being pro-white nationalism and a proud Islamophobe. CLF also spent heavily, through vehicles that were difficult to track, in a failed effort to defend Representative Jamie Herrera Beutler, Republican, Washington, a supporter of former President Donald Trump's second impeachment. After she lost, Democrats were able to pick up the seat on the southern Washington state border. Dan Constan, a McCarthy advisor who runs CLF, said in a statement after McCarthy's ouster that the group remains laser-focused on our mission of holding radical Democrats accountable, protecting our vulnerable incumbents, and expanding the House Republican majority. But no one knows whether the next speaker will have the power or will of McCarthy to be as aggressive in primaries. His hardline opponents in the House have long demanded that these interventions stop. Before McCarthy was elected Speaker in January, Constan agreed to a small concession, that CLF would not involve itself anymore in open primary contests in safe Republican seats. That agreement did not rule out intervention by other groups that worked with McCarthy's team. At a news conference after losing the speakership, McCarthy suggested he could become even more involved in shaping primary campaigns, even if it meant that he was working independently of leadership. Both McCarthy and his allies have made clear their anger at the 8 Republicans who voted to end his speakership. "I told the conference I am a free agent now, aren't I?" McCarthy said, in a thinly veiled warning of possible retribution. "I think I am pretty good at electing people." Whatever he does, the playbook for the 2024 House elections must now be worked out on the fly, in the middle of an election season. Democrats have been crowing, in public and private, in recent days about the confusion that McCarthy's absence could create, including the possibility of more retirements and recruitment challenges. McCarthy famously tried to be all things to all people, and while that was his undoing as Speaker, being a bridge between MAGA world and ultra-wealthy donors made him a good fundraiser, said Tim Persico, former executive director of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. "I doubt any of the heir apparents have those relationships, and trying to replicate decades of work in a few months is damn near impossible." Neither Scalise nor Jordan comes close to McCarthy in the depth of donor relationships or electoral experience, according to Republican strategists. With a donor network he built in the California State Assembly, McCarthy created the Young Guns program during the 2008 cycle, traveling the country to promote a new generation of House candidates. In the 2010 cycle, that program became the name of the NRCC's recruitment program, which McCarthy ran during a cycle that returned a Republican to the Speaker's office. He has remained integrally involved in the effort ever since. For more than a decade, McCarthy traveled the country at nearly every congressional break, meeting with prospective candidates and golfing with billionaires. His annual August donor retreat in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, inherited from a similar event hosted by former Speaker John A. Boehner, Republican, Ohio, became a marquee forum for young politicians to meet the donors who would fund their campaigns. McCarthy also created a joint fundraising program, first called Take Back the House and now called Protect the House, that allows wealthy donors to give hundreds of thousands of dollars at once, with the money split up to support the candidates most at risk of defeat. Ironically, that has meant that McCarthy's program has already transferred more than $100,000 this year to the campaigns of Representative Nancy Mace, Republican, South Carolina, who voted to end his speakership, and Representative Lauren Boebert, Republican, Colorado, who opposed his efforts to pass a spending bill last month. McCarthy's behind-the-scenes power reflects changes in campaign finance laws since the early 2000s that have empowered very wealthy donors and the politicians they trust with their money. Representative Nancy Pelosi, Democrat, California, was able to twice hold the titles of Minority Leader and Speaker because of the dependence of her caucus on her donor network. When she stepped aside last year, one of her top political advisors, Michael Smith, took over at the head of the pro-Democratic House Majority PAC, ensuring continuity as Representative Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat, New York, took charge of the conference. "A new speaker, depending on who it is, can rise to the occasion," said one Republican strategist familiar with the succession discussion happening now, who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss private conversations. "Their greatest challenge is the absence of time. You don't build something like this in months. It took years." Sarah Chamberlain, the president of the Republican Main Street Partnership, described McCarthy as the best fundraiser the Republican Party has had in years. "He's in a league by himself for right now," she said. "We're absolutely hoping that he continues to do that." Lee Ann Caldwell and Mariana Sotomayor contributed to this report. Democrats remove Iowa caucuses from first-in-the-nation status. The decision ends a nearly two-year fight over the state's place in selecting a presidential nominee. St. Louis, the Democratic Party officially dislodged Iowa from its prized status as the first state in the presidential nominating process Friday, approving the state Democratic Party's plan to release their results on Super Tuesday next year. The decision ends a nearly two-year fight over Iowa's place in selecting a Democratic nominee, which resulted in a complete overhaul of the calendar. President Biden and his aides elevated South Carolina to the first spot, followed by New Hampshire and Nevada a week later, and then Michigan. The original plan called for Georgia holding a primary just before Michigan, but Democrats in that state were unable to move up their date because of Republican opposition. The approval Friday moves Iowa out of the early window of the presidential nominating process, but the Democratic National Committee's Rules and Bylaws panel did not resolve outstanding issues with New Hampshire, which has a state law mandating that it hold the first presidential primary. New Hampshire has refused to relinquish its spot to South Carolina, setting up a conflict with the National Party, and members of the DNC Bylaws Committee warned states Friday about potential sanctions should they not abide by the order adopted by the National Party. As part of Iowa's new plan, Democratic voters can sign up to receive a presidential preference card, to be mailed starting January 12, or participate in an in-person precinct caucus on January 15, the same date as Republicans. The party will not release the results of their mail-in caucus until Super Tuesday on March 5, and any cards postmarked on or before that day will be accepted. That plan received conditional compliance from the DNC Bylaws Committee Friday at the National Party's fall meeting in St. Louis. Iowa Democrats, however, are holding out hope that they can return to the early window for the 2028 presidential nominating process. I am pleased to have repeated reassurance from the co-chairs and this committee that the presidential nominating calendar discussions will once again be opened up for 2028, where I expect Iowa to compete strongly for a significant voice in the selection of the Democratic nominee as we have for years, Rita Hart, the chair of the Iowa Democratic Party, wrote in a letter to the committee. Mignon Moore, the co-chair of the Rules and Bylaws Committee, confirmed the DNC intends to review the presidential calendar again for 2028. In New Hampshire, officials have long given Iowa significant leeway to go first because its caucus process differs in important ways from a primary election, though there were some concerns that Iowa's revised plan could have triggered New Hampshire to jump earlier and create chaos in the coming months of the Republican primary campaign. While I am not yet ready to set the date of the New Hampshire presidential primary, the news out of Iowa as to how the Democrats plan to conduct their presidential nominating event is positive in terms of preserving the traditional positions of the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire presidential primary, New Hampshire Secretary of State David Scanlon, Republican, said in a statement. New Hampshire has been planning for a primary, at a date not yet determined, in January. The status of Iowa was imperiled in 2020 after a botched caucus process, which delayed reporting of results and infuriated party leaders who were already dismayed by the state's dearth of racial diversity, the rightward drift of its voters and the leftward drift of its Democratic caucus goers. Biden lost the state to Donald Trump by 8 percentage points in 2020, after coming in a distant fourth in the Democratic caucuses. Iowa Republicans have been concerned that Democrats could force changes to the caucus date, leading to a breakdown in the relationship in between the two state parties, which have a history of coordinating to promote Iowa's first-in-the-nation caucuses. Constant and repeated attempts to thwart Iowa's cherished first-in-the-nation caucus is nothing new, Jeff Kaufman, chair of the Iowa Republican Party, said in a statement. While there have been different tactics deployed this year, including the complicity and incompetence of the Iowa Democratic Party, the Republican Party of Iowa and the Republican National Committee will continue to steadfastly defend our half-century-old carve-out system, to ensure the triumph of grassroots democracy that ultimately strengthens our presidential nominating process. Scherer reported from Washington.